Hi all, let's go over Game 2 of the World Chess Championship between Magnus Carlsen and Nepomniachtchi. So this was played on the 27th of November 2021. So round 2, d4 from Carlsen, we have knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3. So this avoids the possibility of a Nimzo Indian. If knight c3, black could play the Nimzo Indian defense. So knight f3, so we're in Queen's Indian territory. We have d5, but now Catalan. So this Catalan fianchetto over the king's bishop, bishop e7, bishop g2, both sides castle, d takes c4, queen c2. This has been a very interesting battleground, even in the world of engines actually. It used to be the case that neural networks such as Leela were able to actually sometimes get an advantage with the Catalan against the likes of Stockfish. But since Stockfish, became even stronger with neural network technology itself, the results became very different. Stockfish quite dominant now. So anyway, that's in the engine world. This is in the world of practical chess. b5. Now here, already though, at move 8, there seems to be somewhat of an innovative move with knight e5. This seems rarer, at least in, for example, major databases like ChessBase. It seems rarer than a4. With a4, for example, b4, knight d2, trying to hit the rook and recollect the pawn safely is a priority. For example, here knight takes c4, and it's thought that white, for example, in this situation is slightly better. For example, this scenario could emerge with white having a small edge. So this is kind of standard territory, and you never know, it might appear in another game in this match. So knight e5, interesting. So it is hitting the rook, and there's an interesting possibility of black playing queen takes d4 though. Black actually played c6. If queen takes d4, white should, in fact, it seems, play knight takes f7. This is the most accurate way of playing it, rather than immediately taking that rook. And yeah, this is just quite interesting actually. If c6, knight g5, it seems, an interesting position to start off with here. And if king takes, this is actually going to be more interesting for white than for black. Even though it seems as though the bishop's kind of strangely on a8. Yeah, it's an interesting position where white should have an advantage there. So perhaps this is all very interesting preparation by Magnus to support this rare bird move 8, knight e5. So we have c6, a4. If white takes on c6, then here rook b8, which black wants to do that anyway to support the b5 pawn, and black can reinforce the structure. And it's a case where black is doing quite well actually, a small edge there. So okay, so a4 instead keeps the pressure, keeps the threats, keeps the pressure going of the Catalan bishop. We have knight d5, shielding the bishop away from that diagonal. This is a classic maneuver, and it also has the perk that if white dares to play e4, then this is a real classic maneuver to get the knight into d3. We see knight c3, knight f6. If knight b4 immediately, queen d1, this is actually rather interesting. Black has b takes a4 as a solution here against this persistent pressure. So it's a radical solution. It means that, for example, bishop a6, and what is emerging here, if queen takes d4, knight takes f7, yeah, as a desperado for knight takes b5, what is emerging is an interesting position, but white definitely has a nice advantage overall. So white's getting a nice advantage. That's like luring the queen away from a7. White's getting the driving seat there. If we look at that again, I mean, it's all pretty complicated stuff. Let's look at that knight b4 immediately line. And just recap here, there's another question to be posed. Basically, if something like rook c8, then here knight takes b5, bishop takes b4 is crushing actually, hitting the queen, and then this is a really quite crushing position after rook d8 check, knight takes. You see that Catalan bishop just winning the game straight off the bat really. So yeah, that would be a diabolical continuation for black. losing material and the game. So anyway, f6, good safety measure, kicking the knight. So we have now knight f3, queen d7. So queen d7. Does this look like a strange move to anyone? I mean, it supports the pawn chain, indirectly x-raying the defense of b5. It does seem a logical move. If b4, this is more loose thing to black's structure. White could just play a knight retreat, and if bishop a6, bishop d2, yeah, this is actually, it could still be playable for black with c5 hitting white's center. So for example, this situation could actually be playable for black. Black's got active pieces with no major problems. So b4 does seem, it was a possible alternative to queen d7. Okay, e4, knight b4 now, queen e2, knight d3. Now here e5 is played. This does seem a logical move in the circumstance. d5 just leads to pain basically after b4. Knight d1, black can just take on d5 and take that on d5 with no penalty. White's not in the position to punish the black setup at all here, especially with that monster knight on d3. For example, this situation with bishop b7, black's holding things quite comfortably. So e5 is the way to go, it seems, in many respects. Bishop b7. If f takes e5, knight takes e5, things get interesting. So let's say bishop b7. It's more interesting for white, it seems. White can get quite a comfortable position, dismantling the pawn chain, like this, for example. And that is absolutely fantastic for white, actually. And f2 can be shielded. So, you know, the dynamic play is not too much to handle. So bishop b7 is played though. E takes. Bishop takes is played. If rook takes, it seems white can get a pleasant enough position with bishop e3. Yeah, bishop takes really sets some pressure and problems compared to this continuation. It seems with bishop e3, for example, let's say rook f7, knight e5, takes away that knight, leaves white with quite a nice space advantage, nice use of e4 as a pivot square. And for example, this situation is in white's favour. In fact, white has really clever stuff in this line. This is going a bit far and fictional, but white could even play this, celebrating the substitute fianchetto Catalan bishop. If black doesn't take on d6, this is crazy stuff, where white actually emerges better with this attacking prospect. For example, like this, attacking prospects. So yeah, the Catalan being replaced by a queen there in that relation is fascinating. And if bishop takes, this is good for white as well. So yeah, it's interesting stuff. So it seems as though, yeah, bishop takes is much more critical than rook takes. Seems very logical. Okay, we have knight e4 though, now. If bishop e3 instead, c5 is quite powerful for black, undermining the centre, liberating the bishop. If d takes b4, decentralizing potentially white's pieces, but also, even more significantly, gives black these passed pawns. So that's a very dangerous scenario indeed. So black will be in the driving seat there. So knight e4 was played, not bishop e3. This is much better in this situation. Knight a6. So the other knight's coming round potentially to support its fellow knight. If bishop takes d4, that does seem greedy, and it is greedy. Knight takes d4, for example, bishop e3. You can see that this is very tricky for black. If queen e5, this is just one example, where knight g5, e6 is a bit of a target. And again, it's a bit of a target. That e6 pawn would be a bit of a target here. And let's say h6, white's definitely, in the driving seat here. This is like great stuff. For example, this would be dismantling of black a little bit. White's getting a big advantage there with the bishop pair. The black knights are not too happy about this situation. So knight a6 is played. Knight e5. So that challenges that aggressive d3 entrenched knight and hits the queen. So an interesting scenario. If bishop e3 instead, then, for example here, the knights reinforce each other, and black could actually still be actually in trouble. You know, after knight c5, black's still in a bit of trouble here. For example, this situation is troublesome for black. So yeah, it is rather tricky. So yeah, let's go back. So yeah, bishop e3 is actually, it does seem like a viable alternative to knight e5. If there is a viable upgrade to this game, this is one of the points at move 17 where knight e5 was played, where bishop e3 seems tricky for black. So let's recap that again. So on knight e5, we're saying, you know, bishop takes, d takes. And the thing is, let's say c5 instead of knight takes e5, then a takes. Again, this is also, you know, it's nice for white overall. These scenarios are nice for white. For example, like this is nice for white. So that's an interesting point in the game where knight e5, yeah, it looks as though this was a nuisance knight, and maybe it's a reaction, and you know, maybe a bit of emotions coming in, you never know. They're still human, these guys. So knight e5, trying to get rid of that pesky knight on d3 rather than bishop e3. It seems, yeah, bishop e3 has some mileage to it. So bishop takes e5 though is played now. D takes, knight a c5. If knight takes e5 here, then there is a penalty. There's pressure on the e file, and black doesn't want to have a wreck of pawn structure. And there's interesting dynamics here, like this queen sack, which is spectacular behind the scenes. And it seems white's got a huge compensation here. This is just a purely fictional variation. But it does seem overall that there's funny stuff going on here. If knight g6, rook d1, this is also good for white. For example, like this, taking on e6, this is just dismantling black actually. This is just bad news for black. So, okay, we have knight a c5. So wisely here not taking on e5, it seems. And now, you know, there is actually a critical threat of knight b3 forking the rook and bishop. If, yeah, so this is interesting. Magnus plays a very practical move here. I wonder if you can guess what he plays in this position for 100 points. So it seems as though there's a big threat of knight b3, a really annoying attack on the rook and c1. Okay, Magnus plays what I feel a very interesting practical move, knight d6, a virtual exchange sacrifice. If he plays knight takes c5, it seems as though black's very comfortable. For example, here, just snapping on a4, or here with a takes, this position is also rather comfortable for black, with the knight coming back with a vengeance. So this seems a very interesting exchange sacrifice. So knight b3, there's very little choice other than to give up the exchange. You know, if rook a2, then knight b takes c1, for example. If bishop e3, then knight takes, and here, this situation is going to be a nice small edge for black as well. Black's doing it's a very interesting position. These positions very interesting, but it's not as dynamic for white as what was played. So rook b1. So this is pretty dynamic exchange sacrifice. Rook b takes c1. So quite exciting for game 2. No quite dull draw here. Rook takes c1. So white is the exchange down. The rooks really need open roads. So the open roads of the chessboard, the files of the chessboard, and sometimes maybe compromising pawn structure might be a rule violation, aligned at least to trying to activate the rooks along, you know, roads of the chessboard like the files. And so b takes a4 needs to be factored in at various junction points now. For the moment we have rook a b8, which kind of prepares the possibility of b takes, maybe moving the bishop first, which is done actually as a priority out of the firing line. Now there doesn't seem to be too many useful discoveries here. I mean, it is a complicated position, but actually one in which Magnus is more focused not on taking a pawn or anything, but more focused on black's king with bishop e4, trying to generate a lot of potential threats like queen h5, like queen c2, putting pressure on h7. Now, these are very, very complicated dynamic positions, and it's easy for people with engines watching the game live to think, oh, someone's blundered. But, you know, engines looking at millions of positions a second. There's no way, you know, computers can play like, or rather humans can play like computers. Now, at this junction point, so this is at move 24, Nepo for short plays c3. I can call him Nepo, if you don't mind. So c3 is played. If queen e7, queen h5, it turns out g5 is the most accurate way to defend this. For example, this situation, black could play b takes a4 and end up with a small edge with very, very careful, very, very precise play and very paradoxical play, you know, taking that d file rather than anything else, you know, to stop things like rook d7, because white was threatening potentially rook d7. So black ends up with a small edge, but it's frightening stuff, all of this. It is actually frightening stuff. You know, if h6, that will be the end of black with queen g6, and taking here, this would be the end of black, that would be getting exterminated. So for example, like that. And if g6, bishop takes g6, c5 is interesting, because if h takes as an alternative, white actually gets a very strong attack with rook d4 for rook h4. This is a hugely strong attack, demonstrating bouncy roads, what I call bouncy roads of attack to the king, which is a very nifty idea I'm fond of right now. So, you know, this would be a crushing bouncy road of attack with that rook left. So rook left being one, you know, example of such an attacking mechanism. So here, you know, if rook f7, then this is also devastating for black after knight f5. It seems as though, you know, the bishop's not really helping king safety in these variations. And, you know, these make some of these lines very terrifying. You know, if you're on the black side, you don't really want to be annihilated in game 2 of a World Chess Championship. So, yeah, it's an interesting decision point. But let's just entertain b takes a4 here. This wasn't played. Bishop takes h7 might be white's best try with check, rook d4, queen e7. And it looks as though isn't white checkmating because the knight's controlling f7. Actually, this is just total fiction now. Queen takes h4, rook takes b2, and the rooks are coming together. The bishop's potentially being liberated. It's a fun variation to theoretically entertain. So c5 check. It's certainly fun from a theoretical perspective, and easier for us with our engines to examine this kind of stuff. But yeah, b takes a4 does require a certain amount of imagination, to say the least. If queen takes c4 instead here, rook takes b2, sure, black would be absolutely, without too many problems there and better. But yeah, the problems are, result from bishop takes h7. So yeah, b takes a4, although it's along the lines of activating rooks, king safety does need to be factored in. So anyway, in the game, c3 was played. And yeah, in this very interesting situation, we have queen c2 being played. So with the threat of bishop takes h7 check, if b takes, then b takes a4, b takes c3, b takes a4, and here g6 is possible. Yeah, I mean, basically, these are very specific scenarios where black's potentially even. I mean, it's generally even here. So, okay, we have queen c2, g6. If c takes b2, bishop takes h7 check, bishop g6, c5 is logical to liberate the bishop. If this situation gets kind of interesting as well, for example, here some crazy stuff is going on with the bishop, the full pawn bishop around the king. For example, counter exchange sack, deflection tactics. If the queen leaves, queen c1, crazy stuff behind the scenes for sure. Result in a dynamic equality. Yeah, it's crazy stuff, indeed. But okay, g6 was played. We have b takes a4, queen takes a4, rook fd8, rook a1 c5, queen c4. So the bishops come off. Knight takes e4. Black has to trade carefully. King h8. If queen d5, then knight f6 check, and then taking the queen, that would be a disaster. If queen d3, again, that would be a disaster. Check, and the 7th rank is decisive with that rook crashing through. So black has to tread carefully. If queen e7, this is actually a small edge for white, it seems, just scooping up c5. So yeah, king h8, very interesting move. We have knight going back to d6, rook b6, queen takes c5 here. The rook's aligned to double. King g2 away from any rook b1 check, a6, and the king goes to h3. An interesting move, getting the king into relatively more safer position. Rook c6, queen d4, king g8, c4, queen c7, queen g4, and now an interesting moment in this game. So Nepo counter-sacrifices the exchange. So what would happen if this knight is tolerated for a bit longer? Say queen e7. Let's say king g2. Say the knight is tolerated. White could try and build up things with h4, reinforce e5, and maybe use e4 as a pivot point, so that holds c4 and generates opportunities. So this scenario is fascinating, and there is enough, it seems, for white to at least it's scary for black. These scenarios are scary for black. Black's kept on the toes with threats on c6 or f8. So for example here, c5, c6 counterbalances this pawn. This pawn really doesn't get enough time because of c7. If the queen takes, queen f8 is mating. So these scenarios are fascinating in a theoretical sense, but they lead to a situation which would be excruciatingly unpleasant for black, because threats like queen g8, you don't want to see threats like this all the time, or your passed pawn go. This would be unpleasant for sure for black with that entrenched knight on f6. So rook takes d6 takes away all the potential pain like that and suffering, where the knight might be assisting the queen. Yeah, that would be kind of annoying to be having a game like that in game 2. So this, at least, it clarifies the situation. We see c5, and the situation is getting even more clarified now. We see rook takes a6, rook f8, f4, shielding against that rook on the f file, because the queen could have perhaps helped the rook on f3, but now that rook hasn't got access to f3. We have check, and we're going into a simplified rook and pawn ending, which is starting to be like a theoretical draw now. So the game is becoming much more simplified now. g4, we have check, but there is actually an interesting point at the end. Let's just have a look. Check. We have rook h6, rook a4, king f3, check, and rook a4. This is the end of the game. And just for my own entertainment, let's say the white king tried to march down the board and black allowed that, as though setting a trap. Here it's tricky. G takes, black would have to play. Guess what black would have to play? I think I might have given it away. King g6. Yeah, this is logical, really. If king takes, we're walking into the pawn queening with check. So that would be no good at all. That would be losing. But if king g6, we get this scenario, which is also interesting, where both sides queen, but it's like a perpetual check, because the king dare not come down the board. It's just a perpetual check. Because if we looked at that again, if the king went down the board, then the queen's lost. So we get this situation though, which is just perpetual check in the extreme. So that's in a really extreme continuation scenario, which is very unlikely to happen. So yes, a fascinating game indeed. I'll take you to that end of game position. So a kind of very practical exchange sacrifice by Magnus. Maybe there was a missed opportunity at a certain junction point. Instead of knight e5 trying to evict that knight on d3, bishop e3, seems to be a critical improvement, at least from my perspective. It seems as though, when white played knight e5, there was a bit of a trouble zone entered into earlier on. And let's try and recap that scenario at that point in the game where knight e5 was played. So this was at move 17, knight e5. Perhaps there's a key improvement, which to be researched. Bishop e3. This is an interesting compensation position for white. Interesting dynamic Catalan compensation, which shows why the Catalan's very rich in opportunities, and in the engine world, it seems to quite often do well for white. Neural networks have sometimes quite a lot of fun against traditional, more brute force styled engines. Anyway, so very, very interesting game. The rook's craving files, but king safety imbalance. There's a lot of very terrifying complications behind the scenes, which were avoided by Nepo counter sacrificing the exchange. But for me, quite an interesting and rich game. This is a very rich analytical territory, the Catalan. So a very interesting game for Game 2 of the World Chess Championship. For me, it certainly beats, Berlin Wall defense games. Okay, so I hope you got something out of that. By the way, I have a new course on the Smith-Morra Gambit. Check out my courses page, and also in the community tab of the YouTube Kingscrusher channel, you'll see some great discount codes for the next 4 to 5 days for the new Smith-Morra Gambit course, which is a very exciting gambit. If you play 1e4 and want something against the Sicilian defense, the Smith-Morra Gambit, in my view, has been largely underestimated for many years. And I do quite a comprehensive course on this. If you want to check out the free samples in the structure, you might be impressed. So there's a new Smith-Morra Gambit course to check out on Kingscrusher TV/chess courses, or the amazing discounts in the community tab of the Kingscrusher channel just for the next 4 to 5 days. But that one on the courses page is for the next 30 days. So anyway, okay, I hope you enjoyed this particular game coverage of the World Championship, and I might be checking out some other ones which take my interest as well. Okay, thanks very much. Comments, questions, like, share, subscribes, all appreciated. Cheers.